Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition here of Point of View, and for this hour we're going to look at some of the issues in the news, in particular the pandemic, and then a little bit later looking at this has been a very bad week for a number of Democrats, and to be honest, we don't spend a lot of time talking about who's up and who's down and who might be forced out of office and those kinds of things. That's kind of almost inside the baseball kind of issue or in the deep weeds, but I think it does illustrate maybe something that we have started to notice, and that is all the manipulations that have been taking place. I even have a commentary coming out next week just raising the question, have we been played? And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to cover this. Not that necessarily there's a big issue about what has happened to Senator Dianne Feinstein, or, of course, we've already talked about Hunter Biden, and yesterday we even got into Eric Swalwell. So those are individuals, but I think each one of them illustrate again why we just, as we say on this program so often, need to have some discernment, maybe a little bit of common sense. And before it's through, I guess we do need to talk about this Texas lawsuit, and we've posted some articles on that as well. But let's see if we can get into this whole issue of where we are in the pandemic. Jim Garrity said, you know, the current circumstances really are so grim and so bad that we really have to overcome the instinct of not thinking about this for too long and at least try to absorb the issue. Because there are a lot of people saying, well, I think we're on the other side of it. I'm going, this is, I don't think if you've looked at the numbers, the worst spot we've been in since March. The country, as he points out, is averaged about 196,000 new cases per day. And in round numbers, almost 200,000 cases. And you've had a few that were up into to the 219,000 cases a day. Now, again, we've had some people say, well, we're not talking about cases, we're talking about infections. Okay, fine. I do see that as a relevant distinction, but they're still talking about a lot of people that have the virus, whatever that means. And for some, that means something very dire, because we have, as round numbers, more than 100,000 Americans that are hospitalized this moment. And the country has been averaging 2,000 to 2,200 deaths per day, and now it went over 3,000. So it's, you know, really a big issue. And again, sometimes there's so much COVID fatigue that people maybe aren't paying attention to it. The media is focusing on some other issues. And then we're constantly reminded that, well, we haven't filled up the ICU beds. But again, let's look at this. It isn't just the number of ICU beds. It's also whether you have enough hospital staff to take care of patients. And we've had a few situations around the country where individuals have actually had to turn people away. You might say, well, give me some facts. Okay. You have, for example, a few patients in South Dakota that had to be airlifted to Colorado and Wyoming because they ran out of places for them to be treated. New Mexico, all of its largest hospitals are at capacity. 2 hospitals in Youngstown, Ohio, are out of ICU beds. In Bakersfield, California, they're down to 17 remaining, and this is 2 days old, so it may be down to 5 now. Who knows where we are there? State of Arizona, 143 remaining ICU beds, but only, and so you just, start going down to what's happening in particular areas, particular locales, and that is the case. And I understand why people are maybe doing what they think they should do because they're exhausted. And this article reminds us that there's another reason why people aren't taking this seriously. It's because they don't feel like their leaders are taking it seriously. We've talked, of course, about Gavin Newsom, who's the California governor. We've talked about the various senators. We've talked about the mayor of San Francisco and Gavin Newsom at that French Laundry and all sorts of things like that. So this is the case. And then you have all of the inconsistencies. I know we have some Tesla lovers here. The Tesla employees in California are considered essential workers, which is great for the Tesla, but why are some others? Here's one, since some of you like sports. The Golden State Warriors, which is a basketball team, for those of you who don't watch sports, are allowed to practice, but the San Francisco 49ers are not allowed to practice. And the batting cages are closed. Now, I might be missing something here, but if you ever sat in a batting cage, and I've done this a few times, usually you're the only person in the batting cage, right? So, and that's what's, I think, causing people to maybe take this any more seriously. They've seen some of the individuals hypocritically tell you to stay home, and they go out. They tell you you can't go to a restaurant, and then we see them at a restaurant. They tell you not to travel, and they give you that announcement when they're in Cabo, Mexico. Okay, so that's part of it. And then just the inconsistency of how even the lockdowns are implemented is another issue. So anyway, I just thought I would bring that up because it now leads me to a very interesting testimony that took place in the United States Senate. In particular, this was testimony at the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs. And it was actually organized by Chairman Ron Johnson. He's been in the news a lot because he's a senator from Wisconsin, and he's been one pushing for maybe changing some of the rules in Wisconsin or even questioning whether or not they should send electors to vote for Joe Biden to their state capital. But nevertheless, this particular hearing was called Early Outpatient Treatment, an Essential Part of COVID-19 Solution. Okay, that sounds pretty dull. It was anything but dull because what they brought in were a number of doctors and other medical personnel that were complaining about the fact that they can't even use what they think are effective treatments. Of course, one of those would be hydroxychloroquine. But again, there is a long article I have here, but I thought I'd just quote from Dr. Jane Orient because she's been on the program with us. She's the executive director of the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, and she actually encouraged the committee to exercise its oversight over at least federal agencies because she said they are effectively blocking treatment that could prevent 100,000 needless deaths and stop crippling fear and destruction of millions of livelihoods. And she even went on in her prepared testimony to say this is shocking and unprecedented. But in today's litigious environment, doctors who dare prescribe a drug proven to effectively treat COVID-19, hydroxychloroquine, could be fired, removed from insurance panels, investigated, even delicensed, and tells the story of one patient that actually could not get that treatment, so drove all the way from Tucson, Arizona to right here in Dallas in order to get hydroxychloroquine, and his severe symptoms were relieved within hours. So this is part of the testimony. I'll come back and talk a little bit more about what they said, but it illustrates again that if this is a proven treatment, why are so many people being threatened with it? If it's ineffective, then let's show that it is. And I think a lot of it has gotten politicized, and we know why. President Donald Trump said that it was effective, and that was enough for people to just stand up in arms about a treatment that a number of doctors have been using. And that's just one of many we'll talk about right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Most of us are aware how pervasive social media censorship has been over the last few years, but a recent commentary by Daniel Glertner illustrates how bizarre some of the censorship has become. He talks about a Facebook post about World War II that was appended with the false information tag. His comment was about the impact of gun control policies in Germany and how that could have led to the Holocaust. He had these relevant comments about the fact-checking on Facebook. First, he said, is the touchingly naive idea that a complex question, over which historians continue to argue, could be stamped true or false as though it were a fact you simply have been too lazy to look up. This fact-check label was placed on a Yale graduate who writes for Weekly Standard and has written on numerous topics, including military history. Second is the problem, he says, of the fact-checking article, which was full of factual errors. But that's not surprising, he said, when such articles are generally written by a 20-something journalism school graduate who becomes an expert in World War II that afternoon after her supervisor told her to research a meme on the internet. His experience parallels what so many other people have found. Often the fact-checker knows less about the subject than the person who posted the comment on social media. John Stossel recently documented that his YouTube video was slapped with a false label because the fact-checking group didn't like one of the experts he interviewed. The biggest problem with all of this, he says, is that Facebook has decided that this question, remote and unimportant as it might be in our daily lives, was not something you should be allowed to think about. We aren't talking about quack medicine or false information that could affect an election. The fact-checkers are going after any post they don't like. This is censorship greater than any of us would have imagined. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, this hearing that took place was kind of interesting because back in November, the first hearing was actually convened by the chairman, Senator Johnson, and that's where he was even then arguing that sometimes hydroxychloroquine was used as a weapon in the election, and as a result, it has had kind of this damning or damaging label attached to it. And so Jane Orient, and again, this is Dr. Jane Orient, Executive Director of the American Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, has been on the program with us many times before, also has said, you know, if you look at some of these randomized controlled trials, some of the issues of quarantines and lockdowns and things like that don't seem to be working. And again, we've talked about this before with Dr. Jay Richards and others. And so that is the case. And really, the argument she made is what is needed now is an effective early treatment for COVID-19. And certainly we need to not only have a vaccine. She also raised the question. It's going to be a good question to see how this plays out, whether or not the vaccine will be enough to stop the contagion. So it's not like we need one or the other. We need both. We need vaccines, I think. Certainly those that are being developed are going to be implemented truly, but we also need treatment for individuals that already have the COVID-19. And so that is the case. And again, the Senator Johnson said the doctors who have had the courage to follow the Hippocratic Oath and use their off-label prescription rights to treat patients using hydroxychloroquine have been scorned, and state medical boards have threatened to withdraw their licenses. And as I mentioned just a minute ago, I won't go any deeper into the weeds here, but this was not the only thing they were talking about. One of the other doctors there talked about a blocked drug called ivermectin, I think is how you pronounce it. talking about some of the successes there. And then there were some others giving some other kinds of issues and treatments and those kinds of things. And, of course, you always want to make sure that we aren't prescribing or allowing doctors to prescribe quack medicine. Got that. But in some cases, when a particular treatment has been labeled because of this politically charged environment, and thus you're even threatening to remove the license of individuals, threaten lawsuits. I mean, we're in really kind of deep water in that regard. Which brings me to my third article, and then we're going to move on to some other topics. And this comes from our good friend, Dr. Merrill Matthews, is on the program with us as well. And that is, he warns about what are called fake COVID-19 vaccines. Now, I hope most of you would have enough common sense to say that if you go into a clinic or you try to get a vaccine online, let's hope nobody's in the listening audience would even think about that, that you would recognize that if it doesn't have the label like Pfizer or Moderna, you're not going to use it. But nevertheless, he points out that the Institute for Policy Innovation, the organization he's with, has long warned against individuals and state and local officials seeking to import prescription drugs that bypass the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's policies and oversight. Pointed out the fact that the Florida Governor Ron DeSantis was trying to create an importation scheme so that Floridians can import prescription drugs from Canada, although people are not really sure where those drugs come from. And again, it's, I think, should be pretty obvious, but sometimes it's just necessary to say obvious as well. If somebody says, here, I can inject you with this Pfizer drug, and it isn't coming out of dry ice, and at, was it minus 90 degrees Fahrenheit? You do not want that injected into your body. And so he warns us about the fact that, as you might expect, desperate people, in some cases, who might not necessarily have the financial wherewithal to get some kind of vaccine, may go someplace to get those. And so right now, it again, as the FDA is, quote, working with vaccine and drug manufacturers to develop new vaccines for and find more drugs to treat COVID-19 as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, some people and companies are trying to profit from this pandemic by selling unproven and illegally marketed products that make false claims, such as being effective against the coronavirus. And I'd add to that those who stand in a pulpit and say, I'm going to shoo away the COVID-19 disease. So anyway, we've got quite a bit of inference and information. I would hope that even the material that we were just talking about and the material put together by Dr. Merrill Matthews wouldn't even be something that people would seriously take, but sometimes you just have to say a few things that maybe are naturally common sense, but you need to say them anyway. And the Institute for Policy Innovation and the FDA are warning about the fact that you may be having some people suggesting that they have treatments for COVID-19, and even if those are indeed vaccines, they may have been produced in Russia or China, and they may or they may not be effective. So buyer beware, be forewarned. Let's, if we can, just as we make our way into the bottom of this hour, talk about the fact that it has not been a good week for three Democrats, and those three Democrats would be Senator Dianne Feinstein, and I'll talk about that before the break. Certainly not a good week for Hunter Biden, and it really hasn't been a very good week as well for Representative Eric Swalwell. What about Dianne Feinstein? Because that is kind of intriguing. All of a sudden, people are starting to say, I don't think she's there mentally. Oh, my goodness, haven't we noticed this a long time ago? There were times, if you might remember, when she would ask a question, for example, of individuals. And, of course, we've seen her at the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. We've seen her at Amy Coney Barrett's hearings. We've seen her ask, just the other day, she was asking Dorsey of course, Twitter, a question. He answers it. She asked the exact same question. And so, again, he answered the same way he did before and did not realize it. Well, now all of a sudden, Jane Meyer at New Yorker is saying, okay, it's no longer socially and politically required to pretend not to notice Feinstein's memory problems. And this story goes into some detail about the difficulty some of Feinstein's staff have had trying to steer her through a proposed piece of legislation that she said that these words just make no sense. Then also that her short-term memory gone so poor that she often forgets that she's been briefed on a topic. She accuses her staff of failing to actually brief her just after they've just done this. I mean, it's pretty incredible what that is the case. The staff has said that sometimes she seems herself and other times she's almost completely unreachable. And you might say, well, we've known this for a long time. Why now? Two reasons. Number one, didn't want to talk about this during the election, because after all, what you're going to have is if indeed Kamala Harris becomes the vice president, you're going to have a special election for the U.S. Senator in California, but you might have to have a twofer if indeed you are able to force Dianne Feinstein down. And I think that's the point. But the second reason is even greater. Remember a while back when I pointed out the fact that Chuck Schumer had to take her aside because after the hearing on Amy Coney Barrett, she actually went up and hugged Lindsey Graham. Okay, you have somebody who's a Democrat senator hugging a Republican senator and said it was one of the best hearings she'd ever had. Schumer went nuts. And so now he's actually said he's had several serious and painful talks with her and really tried to even enlist her husband, that would be Richard Bloom. And in each case, Dianne Feinstein has been surprised and even upset by Schumer's message. And some people have said it's kind of like the conversation you had about having your grandparents where you have to take the keys to the car away from them. Well, that's a little easier than taking the U.S. Senate seat away from them. But I do believe that a lot of it simply is that the young Democrats have had enough with even the few individuals like Dianne Feinstein, who are too conciliatory towards the Republicans, too old and not woke enough. So this, I think, illustrates only so well that if you hear that she has painfully decided to step down, she was probably shoved and pushed, not jumping. And a lot of this has been surfaced in the last couple of weeks simply because, if nothing else, they recognize that they're probably going to have at least one U.S. Senate race if indeed Kamala Harris is the next vice president. And might have two. And so just as we have two Senate races in Georgia, we might have two Senate races in California. And you can kind of imagine some of the individuals that some of the younger, more progressive, woke kind of Democrat leaders want to get in. And, of course, that will bring us after the break to all the information now coming about Hunter Biden, which was actually released by the Biden campaign. After all, he's too old, he's too white, he's too conciliatory. I think they want to move him out as well. We'll be right back.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
For a few more minutes, let me, if I can, talk about some of the other people that this week probably wish they were not in the news but are. And of course, Dianne Feinstein was one of those. Another one is Hunter Biden. But it kind of brings me back to something I've been saying for a few days and even have a commentary coming out next week in which you sometimes wonder if we're being played. I recognize that sometimes there are people come up with all sorts of bizarre conspiracy theories and things like that. And I think it's better to set most of those aside. But you do know some timing things that make you wonder and at least ask questions. For example, in my commentary that comes out next week, I've said, have you noticed the disappearance of all the protests? Oh, sure, they're trying to set up another kind of Chaz or CHOP up there in Portland, but, there's no Antifa, there's no BLM. There was a flood of violence, and then just a few weeks before the election, it subsided, I think because they were fearful that might affect the election. And now you would think, okay, now we'd be back to normal and you'd see some protests. But has systemic racism and excessive force by the police just disappeared? I mean, it's like they took all their helmets and put them in the closet, all their knee pads and all their bats and all their things that they were using, and we haven't seen any of that. And then you've got, of course, the complaints that were just legion about the danger of the coronavirus vaccine. Governor Andrew Cuomo, presidential candidate Joe Biden, vice presidential candidate Kamala Harris. Now you've heard virtually nothing about that. And I've even made the prediction that if this vaccine turns out to be successful, everybody's going to call it the Biden vaccine, not the Trump vaccine, And while we're talking about the vaccine, haven't you not noticed that Pfizer waited till after the election to announce the progress on their vaccine? And I looked it up and checked it again, and it turns out, yes, during the summer, the executives of the company said they did understand that they were making very good progress, but they didn't update the media and they didn't update the president. They did update one group, the Biden campaign. That's got to tell you something there as well. And then, of course, we've been told for a long time that it's dangerous to send the kids back to school, a large part because, well, the president has called for that to happen and the Secretary of Education has called for that to happen. And now all of a sudden everybody's talking about sending their kids back to school. And, of course, for many years, the argument is that some of these voting machines could be hacked. There were real concerns about unsecured systems. I've got an article here from Senator Elizabeth Warren just a little over a year ago, even expressing concerns about unsecured systems, ambiguous rules about matching signatures. And now all of a sudden, no problem at all. And so you come to the issue of Hunter Biden, because as we have well documented on this program, the information about Hunter Biden has been known for some time in terms of the involvement that he's had with Burisma in the Ukraine. But even now more to the issue that we will be probably talking about more and more in the future, and that is the issue of China and the kind of financial resources that actually went to the Biden family. And yet virtually no one was even allowed to talk about this. And it is amazing because I had a commentary come out just, I think it was yesterday's commentary, about the percentage of people who voted for Joe Biden in some of these swing states who did not know a thing about the Hunter Biden scandal. Now, would that cause all of them to change their vote? No, but there was a percentage that would, and they simply did not know anything about that. And so now, let me read from CNN. After going quiet in the months before the election, federal authorities are now actively investigating the business dealings of Hunter Biden. A person with knowledge of the probe said his father, President-elect Joe Biden, is not implicated. Now that the election is over, the investigation is entering a new phase. Federal prosecutors in Delaware, working with the IRS Criminal Investigation Agency and the FBI, are taking overt steps such as issuing subpoenas and seeking interviews, the person with knowledge said. Activity in the investigation has gone covert in recent months, but now, of course, it's on the top. Politico says that, again, the Southern District of New York, for example, the Securities Fraud Unit, is scrutinizing Hunter Biden's finances, also looking into the connection between Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's brother, James Biden, and a variety of other individuals in that particular regard. And so, again, when you look at all these investigations and even all the information about this, all of a sudden it's surfacing. Now, one thing I thought I might add to this conversation, who actually released this information was the Biden campaign. Now, you could say that maybe they did that in part because they wanted to get out in front of the story. maybe. There are some people that are suggesting, I think reasonably so, that they might have been pushed to do so because, after all, if you again are wanting to implement the kind of policies you would like to implement, up until now, Joe Biden has been kind of this empty shell. He is, for many of the leaders in the Democratic Party, too old, too white, certainly not woke enough, and certainly with a tremendous amount of baggage from the past, and maybe not even mentally up to the opportunity to actually serve as president. And so that's why there have been a fair number of people that are starting to take bets on how many months this individual, Joe Biden, stays in the presidency before he reluctantly says he needs to step down because of the scandals swirling around his family, which have been known for years, but were completely suppressed before the election, and also the mental issues that have been completely ignored, which were, again, very well known. And I think you can see quite a bit of, again, some maneuvering behind the scenes to put the vice presidential well, again, I should say Vice President-elect, because everybody's saying that indeed she's going to become the vice president. But we'll get in just a minute to all the questions about whether or not some of that is going to change with some of these lawsuits. I don't think they are. But nevertheless, that, again, is one of those issues which certainly there are a lot of people in Wall Street. There are a lot of people in Silicon Valley that would rather have Kamala Harris as the president. And you can see the kind of pressure that would be brought on him to actually step down. That is Joe Biden. So we'll see where that goes. But whereas the scandal was suppressed, now it's out in the open, and the Biden campaign, or the president-elect office, whatever you want to call it, has been the one that actually released the information. And then finally, it has been definitely a very bad week for a member of Congress by the name of Eric Swalwell, because he has been an individual who sometimes has been a little bit off the reservation for some of these individuals in Congress. Remember, he was the one that was certainly promoting everything from gun confiscation to the idea that we should have a nuclear strike on some of these individuals. He was one that was speculating about whether Joe Biden might die. He's just there's just a place in which he's been a little bit of a loose cannon anyway. And if nothing else, of course, the thing that has been so difficult for him and his office this week has been this, not just one study, but a series of articles now coming up from Axios reporting his relationship with Fang Fang. Some people called her Bang Bang, but we'll leave it at that. Christine Bang, Fang, whatever, because of his involvement. And a lot of people now are saying he will probably also have to step down. It may only be a matter of time, but as one wag said, can you imagine what the attack ads would be like for the next election? My opponent was literally in bed with Chinese intelligence. I mean, that alone would just be enough to pretty much end his career. And so on the one hand, might be able to get rid of somebody that maybe isn't just the fan of everybody in the House, but the disaster that this would create for Nancy Pelosi. Because an article I didn't post, but it's really worth looking at, points out that with so many of these Democrats losing their seats, we actually now also have another problem, and this happens every time a new administration comes in and begins to select individuals in Congress to serve in the new cabinet. And so Joe Biden has already identified Representatives Cedric Richmond, who is a Democrat from Louisiana, and Marcia Fudge, who's a Democrat from Ohio, to be in his administration. And so you take two more reliable Democratic votes, and you're going to have perhaps some of the closest votes you've ever had. Some people say this may be the slimmest House majority for a party in modern history. It could end up being something like 220 to 213, ultimately meaning that for Nancy Pelosi, she's got to have all of her Democrats vote with her, and if just even 4 defect and vote with the Republicans, she loses. Well, that is going to be even lower if Eric Swalwell steps down. Now, he might be replaced again by another Democrat. And again, let's be honest, these districts in New Orleans and Cleveland probably will eventually be Democratic, but until you have special elections, she's going to face something that no Speaker of the House has ever faced. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, just for a few more minutes. Let's see if we can talk about the second article that we have posted today, Chinese nationals in the U.S. First article is on the Texas education, or the Texas election suit, and we'll be talking about that at the top of the hour. I thought it would be good for everybody to hear some of the developments there. But let's talk about China, simply, of course, because we just talked about Representative Eric Swalwell. But this particular piece from Red State just reminds us of the fact that when you are interacting with a Chinese national, quite likely that individual may indeed be a spy, if not technically like a spy, like Fang was, Christine Fang, then at least working for the Chinese Communist government. I'll get into that in just a minute. But they point out that the disclosures regarding U.S. politicians, including a member of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, Eric Swalwell, again, shows that how they have been compromised by what's called the Chinese honeypot. I'm going to make a distinction between the way Chinese spies work in this country and the way Russian spies work in this country, but we'll get to that in just a minute. And so these are individuals that are associated, especially the honeypot trap, which was certainly Fang Fang, with using the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army as those who are trying to do what they can to infiltrate into this particular government. Now, you may have even seen the movie Red Sparrow or heard about that. That's what the Russians have used. The Red Sparrow has historically been the reference in Russian and Soviet intelligence agencies to use a female intelligence operative, but there to lure Western officials and diplomats into compromising sexual relationships in order to then have, if you will, some kind of leverage over them for blackmail purposes. So again, if you've ever seen even the trailer for Red Sparrow, that's what that's all about. And so the Western intelligence services in the past even have been able to identify a school, a Red Sparrow school, where such operatives underwent training, and then they were deployed in various countries under various cover identities. That's how the Russians have done it oftentimes. Chinese, a little different. The Chinese operate, it says here, in a different manner. The honey trap device is used to place Chinese intelligence assets in positions where they might be able to gather important information over a long period of time. As I mentioned yesterday, they even have kind of the long view in mind. They might work with mayors or city council members, knowing full well that they might eventually be members of Congress or senators or governors or those kinds of things. And it is used in some respects to gain leverage, but it's really more to develop a trusting relationship that can be exploited on a continuing and ongoing basis for as long as they might be able to have that relationship. Having an intern in a congressman's office means having access to what? Computer systems and all physical spaces inside the office, both in Washington, D.C. and also in the congressman or congresswoman's district. And that's the ultimate payoff there as well. Is that what Christine Fang or Fang Fang did? Yes, that's exactly what she did. But here's something else. I've said this on the program once, but again, it's worth bearing some repetition. H.R. McMaster, I've quoted from him before, points out that if you look at what is required of individuals who come over here, in addition to the obvious spies, and we identified some yesterday in Congress, at the MD Anderson Cancer Clinic at Harvard University, and I gave you just a few of those examples, every student who comes over here actually has a responsibility to report back to the Chinese Communist government. That even includes these international students that you bring into your home through international student ministries and others. I'm not saying that they're spies, but if you look back, as H.R. McMaster points out, back in 2014 and then again in 2017, the Chinese Communist Party declared that all Chinese companies must collaborate in gathering intelligence. Also, Article 7 of that says that any organization or citizen actually shall support, assist with, and collaborate with the state intelligence work in accordance with the law and keep the secrets of the national intelligence work known to the public. Chinese companies, alongside universities and research arms of the People's Liberation Army, in addition to espionage and cyber threat by the Ministry of State Security, the party tasked some Chinese students and scholars in the U.S. and at other foreign universities for extracting technology. So you have a responsibility when you come over here to report back anything you find. And the leverage they have over you, your parents, your brothers and sisters, your family, are still back in China. And so that's the case. So this is a Chinese law that any citizen shall support, assist with, and collaborate with the state intelligence work in accordance with the law. So these Chinese students, and I mean some of them are students, but they also come under student visas, and these academics in faculty exchange and others live in this country regularly visit the Chinese consulates to be interviewed by the consulate officials as that is really one of the requirements of being given permission to remain in the United States. You don't need to figure out what would happen if they don't turn over information. They will actually send them back to China. And so there is a tremendous amount of leverage that they really have over them. One other point that I'll make before we take a break, and that is these Confucius Institutes that have sprung up all over the university campuses today were actually being promoted as a cultural exchange for the purpose of giving U.S. college instructors and students greater awareness of China, maybe helping teach Chinese languages, history, and culture. Various Chinese scholars would come over to this country and visit these institutes, and these institutes would then fund travel by academics and students to China. But again, a research study that came out 2 years ago, I think we documented it back then, the institutes were really, as they described then, nothing more than Trojan horses through which Chinese spies gained entry into this country and actually allowed them to do research and conduct espionage. So that just gives you a little bit of an idea of that. And when we come back from the break, we're going to talk about the election. And I found this the other day, and it's worth mentioning. Been talking about the danger of China. We've been talking about the election. Let's bring the two of those together. It turns out that the governor of Georgia, that would be Brian Kemp, was awarded a $107 million contract to the Dominion Voting Systems, and that happened 2 weeks after the Consul General of the People's Republic of China met with him in Atlanta. And of course, you might remember that I shared with you yesterday that it turns out that the People's Republic of China actually purchased the Dominion voting system, according to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And now we find out that the decision to go with the Dominion voting system was hastened in large part because of the General Counsel of the People's Republic of China. The consulate is in Houston, and so he traveled from Houston to Atlanta, met with the governor, and then a $107 million contract was given to the Dominion voting system. As some people said, it isn't that China hacked the election, it's that China bought the voting system and owned the voting system that was used in the election. And that apparently happened because the governor of Georgia had a meeting with one of the key diplomats from China. Again, sleep well, America. That's how some of these decisions are made, and that's why we need to pay more attention. We'll be back right after these important messages.
I am tired. 2020 has been a hard year for most of us, and though I'm guessing that we're all ready to leave it behind, the reality is that 2021 will arrive with its own set of uncertainties. About the only thing that we know for sure is that seeing every issue, every challenge through biblically trained eyes will be sorely needed. That's what you provide to people all across this nation and right here at home as you support Point of View Radio. People are tuning in. They're listening for longer times than before. It reveals that we're all desperate for fresh, rational, reliable, honest, hope-filled perspectives, and that's what you find on Point of View. Without you, that doesn't happen. But with you, hope will flow and hope will grow. Do your part for hope today at pointofview.net/donate or call 800-347-5151. Keep fighting with us. Give today. Pointofview.net/donate and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and over the next couple of hours, we're going to be covering a lot of different topics. So hang on and buckle up, and we'll do our best to try to cover some issues that I think you will really want to know about. First article is on this Texas election lawsuit, and we'll get into that. It talks about the fact that since we announced just the other day that Ken Paxton, who is the Attorney General of the state of Texas, has actually filed that lawsuit with the Supreme Court, looking for original jurisdiction. There have been 17 other attorneys general that have done so, and that is our first article. We'll get to that in just a minute. We have been following the story about Chinese nationals, and that is our second article, which I'll get to after the break. And then just to give you kind of a preview of what's going to happen, we'll be talking with Dale Sellers at the bottom of the hour. His new book is Stalled, and Richie really wants to give hope for those of you that are pastors or elders, deacons, even church members in small churches. He really wants to say that that's where a great deal of teaching is taking place, and sometimes there's too much attention being paid to mega churches, and he really wants to be an encouragement to those of you that are in smaller churches, because after all, I think it's 95% of all churches in the country have actually memberships less than 500. So we're going to talk about that for a little bit. Next hour, Jim Denison will be with us. First of all, we'll maybe start out with some kind of fun things. How do we think about all of the Christmas traditions and all of Christmas from a biblical point of view? And so he has a very significant piece that we'll be talking about. I kind of just jokingly called it, "What does the Bible say about Santa?" But we'll get into much more than that, obviously. And then, of course, he has some thoughts about these various issues that are unfolding before us in the political sphere. So I think you will appreciate his conversation, and especially while he's with us. I believe he's not with us for the entire hour. Sometimes he is and sometimes he's not. Then that will leave lots of time for your comments or questions. And again, if you want to interact with anything we're talking about in these 2 hours, give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. My first article is just, first of all, just kind of an update on this particular suit. And that is that now you have 17 other states that have filed a brief in support of the suit brought by the Attorney General Ken Paxton. The suit basically would prevent electors from Michigan, Georgia, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania from participating in the Electoral College next Monday. I think it's a tough sell. Matter of fact, I've got one article here by somebody I have high respect for. Andrew McCarthy calls it a frivolous lawsuit. And then I have others here that are saying, well, it's got some merit. I've got my doubts, but okay. I'll try to be fair to it for the moment, explain to you what would happen if it was successful and why I don't think that it will be. And then I think I've covered the bases as best I can. First of all, those of you might say, okay, how many states have joined? Because you may be in a state where your attorney general has joined with them, and that would be Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Indiana, Kansas, Louisiana, Missouri, Mississippi, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, Utah, and West Virginia. Almost all of the states represented by Republican officials in the filing. All but 3 have Republican governors. So, again, you're seeing an interesting kind of situation. And the Supreme Court actually gave the states until 3 p.m. today to file their responses. So that's where we are. I believe that's 3 p.m. Eastern, so it might even be that the Supreme Court would give us a ruling before the end of the program, and not a ruling on it, but ruling whether or not they would even take the case, because this is called certiorari, whether it's cert. Okay, let me get into it a little bit. This has, of course, been brought by the Attorney General in the state of Texas, but, of course, you now have 17 other states that have joined, suing essentially Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin. What are they saying? They say they, that is, accomplish these statutory revisions through executive fiat or friendly lawsuits, thereby weakening ballot integrity. This suit goes on to say, finally, these same government officials flooded the defendants' states with millions of ballots to be sent through the mails or placed in drop boxes with little or no chain of custody, and at the same time weakened the strongest security measures protecting the integrity of the vote, signature verification, and witness requirements. So what they are asking is that the court would extend the December 14th deadline. That is the deadline for next week, in which you have states going to their capital with their electors and voting for the individual that won that state, whether it's Joe Biden or whether it's Donald Trump, okay? And they are actually arguing that really there is only one date that is mandated in the Constitution, and that is January 20th, 2021. Now, you have to go through some of the details. Some of the arguments are that local election officials flagrantly violated numerous state election laws. True. Rejection rates for mail-in ballots were much lower than primary elections. Again, that's true. And so you might say, okay, I don't disagree with that, because my stance has pretty much been since the beginning, yes, we've had some voter irregularities. We've had some individuals that have done some things, changed the rules in mid-election without the approval of the legislature. So all of that is true. But then the question in the back of my mind is, well, what do you do about it? Because, okay, if you are assuming that certain people voted that shouldn't have voted, dead people voting, for example, people that shouldn't have been voted because they're felons or they're here illegally or whatever, or individuals that voted twice and all that, how do you fix that? Because my argument has always been, well, the horse is out of the barn. Well, Ken Paxton uses a different metaphor. He says the genie's out of the bottle. Okay, so how do you fix it now? We don't have those envelopes tied to the ballots. It's already happened. So what can you do? And the argument is that that's when then the state legislatures would convene and determine which of those set of electors they would actually send. And in some cases, perhaps it might have a Republican legislature, for example, in Michigan or Pennsylvania, send electors to elect Donald Trump to their state capital. And, of course, there's always been a question as to whether or not the governor, let's take Michigan, whether Gretchen Whitmer could veto it. The argument seems to be no, could not be, and so this could be done, or that they refuse to send electors at all, and thus neither Joe Biden nor, of course, Donald Trump have 270 electoral votes. So when it goes to the House of Representatives, where both chambers meet, both the representatives and the senators, they would have to resolve the question. That's a pretty hefty lift, isn't it? I don't see it happening, but it's 2020. Anything is, I guess, possible. But the first hurdle is whether or not the Supreme Court would even hear the case. We will see where that plays out. Maybe tomorrow we'll be talking about that with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford. And if indeed they do hear the case, Donald Trump has made it very clear that he wants Texas Senator Ted Cruz to present the case before the United States Supreme Court. That's all we know. We'll know more in a few hours or a few days. I'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Most of us are aware how pervasive social media censorship has been over the last few years, but a recent commentary by Daniel Glertner illustrates how bizarre some of the censorship has become. He talks about a Facebook post about World War II that was appended with the false information tag. His comment was about the impact of gun control policies in Germany and how that could have led to the Holocaust. He had these relevant comments about the fact-checking on Facebook. First, he said, is the touchingly naive idea that a complex question, over which historians continue to argue, could be stamped true or false as though it were a fact you simply have been too lazy to look up. This fact-check label was placed on a Yale graduate who writes for Weekly Standard and has written on numerous topics, including military history. Second is the problem, he says, of the fact-checking article, which was full of factual errors. But that's not surprising, he said, when such articles are generally written by a 20-something journalism school graduate who becomes an expert in World War II that afternoon after her supervisor told her to research a meme on the internet. His experience parallels what so many other people have found. Often the fact-checker knows less about the subject than the person who posted the comment on social media. John Stossel recently documented that his YouTube video was slapped with a false label because the fact-checking group didn't like one of the experts he interviewed. The biggest problem with all of this, he says, is that Facebook has decided that this question, remote and unimportant as it might be in our daily lives, was not something you should be allowed to think about. We're not talking about quack medicine or false information that could affect an election. The fact-checkers are going after any post they don't like. This is censorship greater than any of us would have imagined. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Dale Sellers will be with us in about 15 minutes, but we'll take some of those phone calls. But just before we do so, let me just mention that we will be talking about some of this tomorrow because there is planned what is called Jericho marches around the U.S. Capitol building, the Supreme Court, and the Department of Justice. And that will be taking place on Saturday. And at the same time, these rallies will also be taking place as well in the capitals of Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Again, those will take place at noon on December 12th. These will then be followed by what is called Let the Church Roar Prayer Rally. And we will actually have a guest tomorrow as we will be talking with Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford in that regard. And so the MC of the prayer rally on the National Mall is Eric Metaxas, who's been on the program. Some of the other speakers include Michael Flynn and kind of a who's who of a number of individuals, some of whom have been on the program and others have not. Some of the faith leaders are people I am very familiar with. Some of them I've not heard of, but this is kind of a big event. It will be taking place not only in Washington, D.C. on Saturday, but also in the capitals of the states of Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So that's kind of a update as well on what is happening is sort of in the prayer and public testimony, if you will, on this whole issue. So if you want to know more about that, we will be covering that tomorrow and interviewing somebody who will be part of those rallies. Let's take some phone calls. We'll head up, first of all, to, I think, Nebraska. KCMI and Judy, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you for taking my call.
What would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, I was just wondering, you say that the suit brought by Texas was not probably going to, you didn't think it was going to work, so I'm just asking, well, what do you think would work? I mean, do we just sit back and let the election fraud and all of that go by, or what is your answer to the problem?
That's a good question, because a lot of people say, well, we've got to do something. And I think what we do is to recognize that some of this should have been addressed a long time ago. And we can certainly see what possible challenges will take place. I do know that when it goes to the House of Representatives, and that will be on January 6th, which, interesting enough, just the day after the two Senate elections there in Georgia, there are people now talking about challenging that. And if you remember, 4 years ago, there were some Democrats that wanted to challenge the election of certainly Donald Trump, and that's where then the sitting vice president, Joe Biden, actually said, come on, guys, I think it's over. He won. This time, would Mike Pence make the same statement? I'm not sure that he would, and so it could lead into a debate, which is something that probably at least puts it in the hands of Congress. Now, if that did take place, and if indeed there were enough people to actually protest it. And from what I understand from the law, you only need a member of the House. I'm sure you got one of those. We already have a member of the Senate, it looks like. They have to, in some way or another, in writing, express their concerns about the fact that there is fraud that has taken place. And then the chambers separate, and there is a debate that takes place in the Senate and a debate that takes place in the House of Representatives. So certainly those are some things that could take place. But what we're trying to do right now is something I've talked about on this program before, how difficult it would be for a judge, or in this case, a Supreme Court justice, to invalidate any of these votes. First of all, because, as I said, the horse is out of the barn or the genie's out of the bottle. But more importantly, just think about what a judge would have to do, because he or she would have to say, well, these people voted according to the rules that were available at the time. Even if the rules were illegal, it would be like somebody actually getting a ticket for parking in a no parking zone and there's no sign. They say, well, there was a sign there, but it wasn't there when I was there. Well, we would say that'd be unfair for you to actually give them a parking ticket, or you can think of all sorts of other better metaphors for that. We, at the time, recognized that some of these county election officials, some of these judges, violated the law. They broke the law constitutionally. The Supreme Court decided not to decide on the case out of Pennsylvania. So now to come back and say, well, we're going to invalidate those particular ballots because you actually voted according to the rules that existed at the time, but those rules were illegal, it's going to be tough for a judge to do that. So all of these attempts I've suggested going to the Supreme Court, really going to be tough, going to the federal courts. And so far, the lawyers representing the president like 0 for, I don't know what the number is, 0 for 15, 0 for 20, something like this right now. So we'll see. It is at least theoretically possible, though, that the remedy being suggested by Ken Paxton isn't that we're asking you to invalidate any of the rules. We're just simply asking you to extend the opportunity for some of these legislators to sit down and reevaluate that. And so would the legislature in Michigan or Arizona or Georgia or Pennsylvania say, you know, there's been enough, if you will, voter irregularities, not to mention possible fraud, that would cause us to want to send a different set of electors to the state capitol? let me add one more point, and then I'll probably beat this to death. And that is, I've mentioned and have a commentary coming out, I guess it's tomorrow, isn't it? The one on the fact that one of the more contested elections back in the 19th century, a couple of states sent both electors, both Republicans and Democrats. That's another theoretical possibility, which then forced, for sure, the Congress to have to sort out the issue. So those are some possible remedies. The ultimate remedy is for us to recognize that voter fraud has been taking place for years. We've been assured by so many people that it's insignificant. It maybe is as unlikely to have affected an election. I think this time we have now all the evidence necessary that there are some states that need to fix their system. And as we talked about with Eric Eggers the other day, he's in Florida. He said, after 2000, we figured we had to fix some things in Florida, and Florida went without a hitch. I think the wake-up call now is for some of these swing states that obviously they aren't very serious about an election integrity, and it's time to go and fix some of those issues, maybe even to find some individuals that actually violated the law, and that's something that needs to take place at the statewide level. But just before we take a break, let me mention that one more article that we've posted here today before we get into our conversation with Dale Sellers is about Chinese nationals. And this has not been a good week for Representative Eric Swalwell from California because of the fact that he was involved with what is called a Chinese honeypot. This goes into a lot more detail in reminding us that the Russians have always used kind of what is called a Red Sparrow kind of influence, where they would have female intelligence operatives actually trained at a school to put Western officials and diplomats into compromising sexual relations to use leverage for blackmail. The Chinese have used a different kind of strategy called the honey trap. And as a result, they are still trying to use leverage, but in most cases to try to develop, if you will, a trusting relationship and have access to lots of information, and maybe even to place an intern in the congressman's office, which is exactly what Fang or China Christine Fang was able to do, because then you have access to the computer systems and the physical spaces, and both in the Washington, D.C. office and the congressman's office. And that, of course, was what was done with Eric Swalwell, who, by the way, is a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and has a level of intelligence information that very few other people have. The article goes on, though, to remind us that every student that comes over here, every academic that comes over here is required by Chinese law to actually support, assist, and collaborate with the state intelligence work of the Communist Chinese government. And so as a result, we have to recognize that all of them may be collecting information, even if they aren't an actual spy. And then, of course, we've got these Confucius Institutes, which are located at various universities, which 2 years ago we talked about on this program are nothing more than a Trojan horse by which Chinese spies could gain entry into this country and to conduct espionage. So if nothing else, just a reminder once again of the influence of China. And, of course, it was actually the China consul government in general of the People's Republic of China that actually met with the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp. And then later he awarded $100 million to Dominion Voting Systems, which is now owned by the Chinese communists. A lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's, if we can, talk about ministry for a while, especially church ministry. And we're going to be looking at small churches and medium-sized churches because, after all, 95% of the churches in America have individuals or attendees and congregations of less than 500. And that is no doubt representing your particular church, most likely. And what about that? And then, of course, also the real concern that pastors are oftentimes overworked, underpaid, struggling, stressed out. It's been stressful for all of us in 2020, but certainly pastors have felt the brunt of that as well, which is one of the reasons I wanted to bring Dale Sellers on the program. He's the author of this new book called Stalled. He's also the executive director of 95 Network, because we just talked about that 95%. He's been in ministry 40 years, an individual that kind of leads some of these conferences that you will know about. Also a facilitator for Vision Day, and we have a link to his website and also information about this book on our website, pointofview.net. Dale, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with you.
Let's see if we can talk about this idea of a network, because we do almost always, when we have people talking about churches, there is a natural tendency to gravitate to the megachurch pastors and the megachurches. Oftentimes they're the ones being interviewed by the major media, even Christian media. And yet, as you point out, you're dealing with and ministering to the vast majority of pastors. And even if you're not a pastor listening right now, you might be an elder, a deacon, or just a church member in a small church, which is where a lot of that ministry is taking place. And that's one of the reasons I know that you formed the 95 Network.
Well, Kerby, the thing is I actually have been in ministry for 40 years. The first 10 years that I was in ministry, my wife and I traveled back in the 80s with a Christian music group. And so we were able to be in about 1,100 churches in that time, and we just noticed that most of the pastors that we met, and even the staffers, seemed to be very discouraged. Over the years, I've had the chance to work in a couple of churches that are a little bit larger, but I pastored a small church myself for 12 years, and that church grew from 30 to 300 back to 150 because we had a split. And the church split basically because I didn't lead well, and what I mean by that was I just hadn't been trained to lead, and I was figuring it out on my own. And so something kind of happened inside of me through those years where I just felt like a failure. Specifically, I felt like the Lord was disappointed with me, and so that's kind of what led me to reach this place in my life where I began to think I should have been there by now. And that's what led to the writing of Stalled.
And again, the book is really divided into three sections. Why can't I get there, which we'll talk about. What will I find there, and the fulfillment of living there. And one of the things that early on in your book you talk about is your blind spot. And you were honest enough to then even post your kind of annual performance scale. And so it looks at personal life and family life and professional life and things of that nature. And that was another issue as well. So for just a minute, let's talk about pastors who find themselves trying to do it all and yet working incredible number of hours, because you give us some of the facts and figures there. 75% of pastors report being extremely stressed or highly stressed. 90% work anywhere from 55 to 75 hours. 90% feel fatigued. Of course, 70% say they feel grossly underpaid. This is, if you will, almost combat pay requirement, and yet that's where pastors find themselves, and they get chewed up by a church or two, a church split, as you mentioned just a minute ago, and they may think they're doing pretty well, and then there's some blind spots. Speak to that, if you might.
Well, I think one of the big things that happens to us, Kerby, is there's a lot of our pastors who define their life by what they do, instead of understanding that pastoring is something that God's called them to do, but it does not define who they are. And so in many cases, a pastor will not be an equipper. They will not allow people to do things in the ministry because they need to do things to kind of make themselves fill their emotional tank, if you will. And so the church stays small because the pastor feels like they have to do it all. And they kind of get on this treadmill where you just can't seem to finally ever get any peace, if you will. Another issue in our small churches specifically is a lot of our small churches view our pastors as to use a biblical term, as a hireling. And their thought is, well, we hired you to do all the ministry. And because of those two approaches, either one, the pastor feels like they have to do it all because they define themselves by what they do, or the church expects them to do that. It just creates these areas in our life where we're headed down a road. The best way I could describe it, it would be like going down the road, down the interstate, and you're ignoring all the roadblock signs because the bridge is out. Eventually, something's going to happen to where you crash, or something's going to happen because of the blind spots that you have in your life. And the thing about blind spots are you can't see them, but everybody around you can see them.
And that's why you need some people, obviously, to come alongside, be an encouragement, keep you accountable. But let's look at a biblical passage, because you also talk about this, sitting versus serving. And anybody that turns to Luke chapter 10 knows the story of Mary and Martha. And you actually even talk about the fact that, as pastors, we've all probably at times, or Sunday school teachers, or even individuals sitting in churches have heard all about this. But you said, if I've been completely transparent, I have a feeling that I would have done exactly what Martha did. I would have assumed that my service that day was being rated. I would have expected Jesus to peer through his spiritual microscope and critique my performance. And I would be called out and evaluated in front of everyone's evening end. Like Martha, I would have been so caught up in serving Jesus that I would have inadvertently ignored simply hanging out with him. And there is a sense in which, if you ask some pastors how much time you spend in the Word, you'd be shocked by how little it is, because they're so busy doing the ministry that sometimes it's Saturday night, they're actually spending time in God's Word, producing a sermon, and something is really out of balance there, isn't it?
Well, I think what happens to us, Kerby, is that we view this passage about Mary and Martha as though Martha was the one who was wrong and Mary was the one who was right. But if you study it, you see that it says that Mary left Martha from serving. So Mary did some serving, and Martha had also been sitting at his feet, but she left to go do her serving. And so it's just the approach that both ladies had toward the relationship with Jesus. Martha felt like she had to perform. And I grew up in a tradition where we were taught you're saved by grace. It's a free gift, free gift, free gift. But then you prove how saved you are by what you do. And that became part of who I was. So that's why in the book I make the statement that I feel like if I had been there, I probably would have done what Martha had done, where it just felt like I can't sit down. And so, like, the cool thing about that passage is Jesus basically looks at and says, listen, Mary has chosen the right thing. In the Old King James, I think it says she's chosen the good part. In the Message translation, it says she's chosen what's essential. And what's essential is that we develop an intimate relationship with Jesus that's not built on our works, but it's just built on his grace and developing a relationship with him to where he pours through us, so that instead of us making plans and asking him to bless them, we go to him and get the plan, and then we follow through with what he's told us to do.
I just mentioned that the second section there is where you kind of look at the present, and one of the things you talk about are traits, and one of those is approval and acceptance. And it seems to me that you're actually helping, and this could be certainly for pastors, for Sunday school teachers, Bible fellowship leaders, even small group leaders. So it isn't just necessarily pastors that will benefit from this. Any of us that find ourselves in a teaching situation, certainly we're looking for approval and acceptance, but we got to be real careful about that, don't we?
It's okay to want to feel like that you're being approved. It's okay to feel like that, people, they see the gift of God on your life. But if you're dysfunctional, where you're at a place in your life where you need to perform in front of people, no matter what you're doing, so you can build your emotional tank again off acceptance, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble. And that's why sometimes you'll see great ministers that are known all over the world who fall because they got into this place in their life where ministry became about they needed the approval of man. And in the book, I quote my friend Dan Lee Ann, and he made this statement. He says, if you go into ministry to get the approval of man, you will eventually be slaughtered by their disapproval. Wow. And so what happens to us is that when we enter into ministry to try to fill something that's empty on the inside of us, it usually turns out negatively.
Well, let's take a break, and we come back. Again, so much in this book, but I just wanted you to be aware of that. And we have information about the 95network.org on our website. We have information about the book Stalled. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about a sweet spot. You know, we've talked about sweet spot with Max Lucado, but one of the things that Dale Sellers talks about is the unknown sweet spot and the sweet spot of purpose and how to fit that together. Because whether you're a pastor or not, I think you're going to benefit from some of the things we're talking about in the book, but we have one of those mandatory breaks, so we'll take a break and continue our conversation. As you go to the website, you're going to find some great material, including information about the 95 Network and this new book. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dale Sellers. This book, Stalled, came out in September, and you should be able to find it in your local bookstore. But if not, we have an opportunity for you to go to his website, 95network.org. Of course, there's also information that we've posted where you can get it both in hardback and Kindle. I do want to get to the sweet spot, but I thought I'd also mention something else I thought was very relevant in your book, the tweet that changed my life. And you know, Dale, that a lot of us that are kind of type A, we always want to make sure that we don't disappoint anyone. We don't want to disappoint God. And yet you had a friend, Shane Duffy, who actually posted this, and it actually hits you pretty hard. You can't let God down because you're not holding him up. That was a great line. And that one pretty much changed your life and really caused you to reevaluate a great deal. So I just wanted to mention that. But I did kind of talk about this idea of a sweet spot. We've talked about a sweet spot with Max Lucado because he deals with that in his book. You have a whole chapter on that. But I think one thing that I found very intriguing is that we have the sweet spot, and then we have the unknown sweet spot, and then we have kind of the sweet spot between, and this is kind of like more Venn diagrams, between God's glory, your joy, and God, world's good. But talk about this because in some respects, if you're going to do ministry, and I don't care if you're going to be a pastor preaching in a church, whether you're going to be an executive pastor and you're just going to organize all the things behind the scenes, whether you're going to be an elder, a deacon, whether you're going to be just a church leader, whether you're going to be teaching a Sunday school class, or whether you're just going to be an attender in a church, finding that sweet spot and having the right sweet spot and matching that with God's calling is absolutely crucial, isn't it?
Yes, sir. I've been in ministry, like I said, for almost 40 years. I'm 58 years old. And when I was a teenager, if a young person felt called into ministry, their thought was, I need to be a pastor of a church. And so what happens, you go to school, you go to seminary, and a lot of folks who are actual pastoring churches have a call to ministry, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're called to pastor. So what happens is they spend all these years struggling and straining, trying to understand what's happening in their life. And they get to a place, even to refer back to that tweet earlier, where they feel like they're letting God down because they're not experiencing joy. They're not experiencing fruitfulness. And so what people have to understand is God's wired us all with a specific way of how he created us to do certain things. And there's this place in life, a place in ministry, where what you want to do is you want to look at what brings God glory, what brings you joy, and what brings the world good. And where those intersect in a Venn diagram, that's your sweet spot. Now, here's the reason I wrote this part about your sweet spot of success. Sometimes what happens in ministry or in life in any arena is you're living life, you're moving along, and everything is going great. And what you don't recognize is while you're in your sweet spot, there's an unknown sweet spot that God's opening up for you. You'll never realize until you're faithful in this one. And it's just the coolest place in the world to be, to where you really move into what God created you to do with your life. And it's okay to enjoy that.
But I think it also illustrates the fact that one of the great challenges, I think, in the Christian life is to recognize that God is not done with you when you graduate from college or seminary or Bible college, whatever it might be. I think all of us, and I'm older than you are, so I'm really old, actually discover that there are things that I discovered about my abilities in my 30s, 40s, 50s, even 60s that I did not know when I was in my 20s. And I guarantee you, if you had asked me what I would be doing when I was even in high school or college, what I'm doing right now was not on the list. It wasn't even close on the list. If you look at some of the hobbies that I'm involved with now, none of that would have even occurred to me. So there is a sense in which, as you said, you have to not only be faithful in the small things, but God will then take you to other things, maybe larger things, maybe not. And so really what you're trying to do is help people understand how to follow God's call, which brings me to what I wanted to cover for a few minutes in terms of your website, because as much as I want to point people to the book, and it's a great book, and I've certainly benefited from it, I want to also have people know that by going to 95network.org, there's a lot of resources there that are available, and I certainly would highly recommend any pastor, especially in a small to medium-sized church, going there, but all sorts of others that listen to this program that are in positions of church leadership in some way or another would benefit. So talk about what people find when they land at 95 Network and what they can use from some of the resources we've posted on our website.
We have what we call the 4 C's, which is content, coaching, conferences, and consulting. And what we do is when someone joins 95 Network, for $95 a year, they can join. And we've created a portal where we've got so much content there to help them in their leadership and develop their church, their ministry, whatever. And so then we do We do coaching where we provide opportunities for pastors or leaders to have someone to coach them through how to do things. Because as we said earlier, sometimes we come out of seminary and we know how to teach the Bible, but we don't know how to lead. We do a conference. Some of them we do virtually. Sometimes we do them in person, where we go and we teach a couple of different conferences. And then we also do a consulting piece where I actually will come to an individual church and help them just get clarity on who they're trying to reach with their mission and vision. All of that can be found inside the website, as well as we have a blog, and we also have a podcast that we do called the 95 Podcast that we try to release one of those once a week, designed to encourage and strengthen. Everything that we do is to try to help the small church.
Let's also talk about the fact that there's a place where people can click on a button that says Get Vision Box, and that is a kind of strategic planning. We all know that the big churches bring in the top consultants, and they spend what I think is an inordinate amount of money sometimes to clarify vision and strategy and those kinds of things. But you've provided that for something that's quite affordable for a small church or a medium-sized church, and that is the case as well. So talk about that, because that's something I thought was really very striking in terms of what you have on your website.
All of our resources are designed with this thought in mind. I believe that most of the great resources that are available are out of reach for small churches, because I was a small church pastor and I couldn't pay the price that things cost. And so with Vision Box, it's our one-day conference that we do, but we put it on DVD, and also you can go online and use it as well. And it's designed to help a church work through their mission, vision, leadership development, help them to get a clarity in the discipleship path, help them to learn how to communicate effectively both in and outside the church, and then it wraps up talking about how to create a healthy volunteer culture. That is literally what we do in our one-day conference, but we wanted to be able to have the pastors take it back and teach it to their people. And so we designed it with the small church in mind.
Again, Dr. Jim Denison will be with us in just a minute, and we'll continue having a conversation about ministry and some of that. But Dale Sellers has been with us, and again, I would encourage you to go to 95 Network, or simply just go to the website, pointofview.net, and we have information about him on the website, information about this book, also a link to his Facebook page, his Twitter feed, and, of course, the web page as well. And again, the book is just out. It's been out a couple of months. It's available both in hardcover and Kindle, and it's just a great resource, and I just wanted you to know more about what he is doing to be an encouragement to those of you in church leadership with a small or medium-sized church. So, Dale Sellers, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate what you do.
We are going to be talking with Jim Denison in the next hour, and we'll have a little bit of fun. First of all, talking about what does the Bible say about Christmas, and what about trees and Santa and all those kinds of things, and how do we think about all of that? And then we'll get into some of the issues in the news and how we can influence our culture, and so much more that we learned from the Denison Forum, and obviously from Dr. Jim Denison. He will be with us right after these important messages.
I am tired. 2020 has been a hard year for most of us, and though I'm guessing that we're all ready to leave it behind, the reality is that 2021 will arrive with its own set of uncertainties. About the only thing that we know for sure is that seeing every issue, every challenge through biblically trained eyes will be sorely needed. That's what you provide to people all across this nation and right here at home as you support Point of View Radio. People are tuning in. They're listening for longer times than before. It reveals that we're all desperate for fresh, rational, reliable, honest, hope-filled perspectives, and that's what you find on Point of View. Without you, that doesn't happen. But with you, hope will flow and hope will grow. Do your part for hope today at pointofview.net/donate or call 800-347-5151. Keep fighting with us. Give today. Pointofview.net/donate and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we have an opportunity to talk with our good friend, Dr. Jim Denison. And one of the things I love about the Denison Forum and also the Denison Ministries is how they address so many great material issues and actually provide us with great material, because you have, you know, his 7 Critical Issues book, for example, and all sorts of biblical insight to tough questions resources. But most importantly, I've encouraged all of you to subscribe to his daily article. We also are in the midst of Advent, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to actually benefit from some of those resources through Denison Ministries. But let's, if we can, also mention that one of the articles we've posted, What Does the Bible Say About Santa Claus? How to Turn Holidays into Holy Days. And you might think that's going to be fairly quick. Well, actually, this, when I printed out, took 11 pages because, again, some great material from Jim Denison, and they do all these white pages on things ranging from racism to immigration to all sorts of other topics that we have addressed on the program. So I thought we would just do this. We're 2 weeks away from Christmas Eve, and so I thought it'd be appropriate. And then we'll get into some of the other articles that have surfaced recently in the daily article. But if you're not familiar, Dr. Jim Denison is the head of Denison Forum. The daily article and the podcast are just reaching an enormous number of people worldwide. He is a graduate of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, having the PhD and the Master's of Divinity from there. Has been a pastor of churches in Texas and Georgia. And Jim Denison, just always great to have you on the program.
Kerby, thank you so much. I am delighted to be back with you today, my friend.
Let's, if we can, get into why you decided to do a white paper on churches and how Christians think about this and holidays and holy days and those kinds of things, because in some respects there isn't a topic you haven't tried to address, but this one is really one of the more controversial ones, isn't it?
Well, it actually can be in some interesting ways. So I've got to come at this from an entirely personal perspective. I have 2 sons, and they're wonderful, and we're grateful for them. They have 2 grandchildren apiece. And Kerby, my 4 grandchildren are perfect. They are brilliant, they are beautiful, and inherited original sin has skipped them somehow. I don't know how that's possible, but theologically I wouldn't have said it could happen, but I'm convinced that that's absolutely true. My sons aren't entirely sure of that, but nonetheless. So my oldest grandchild is 6 years old, about to turn 7. She's the only granddaughter of the 4. In fact, she's the first girl we've had in 6 generations. I am putty in her hands. And now we're at that age where we're starting to ask ourselves, what do we say about Santa Claus? What do we tell our kids? What do we tell our grandkids? How do we handle the commercialism, the secularism, increasingly secular nature of the culture of these days? It's a question we ask around this time of year quite often. So I thought we'd pull together some biblical and historical resources for my kids and for others who are asking and tackling this question in these days.
I thought that was kind of appropriate because we each year provide a Thanksgiving quiz, sometimes a Christmas quiz, but the Thanksgiving quiz is one that kind of developed because after all, I was just tired around the Thanksgiving table asking the kids what they were thankful for, and it was their dog, their cat, their doll. I said, we got to do better here. And this is the same kind of thing. And I might just mention, we'll get to this a little bit later, but I also posted a piece that came just a few days ago in which you had a man that posted and actually put up a black Santa Claus on his lawn, and you addressed that issue as well. So we actually have a couple of links. And if you find yourself saying, I'd like to know about this, or I'd like to know some of the history of these traditions, let's do so. And the history behind Santa Claus actually is quite accurate and biblical if you think about it, because it goes back to a man by the name of Nicholas. Tell us more if you might.
It does. You bet. Born around 280 A.D. in Myra, what we would call Turkey today, Asia Minor back in the day. He became one of the most venerated of the saints of Christian history. He especially cared about impoverished children. He would leave gifts for them on their doorstep, sometimes on their chimney. He actually wore a red and white robe, interestingly enough. And over the centuries, he just became especially appreciated for his outreach to children and to families in need. Well, the Dutch especially came to venerate St. Nicholas, or St. Nicolaas, as they would say, which eventually gets anglicized into Santa Claus. Then you fast forward to 1822 and Clement Clark Moore and that wonderful poem, The Night Before Christmas, which when it was illustrated into a book gave us the images of Santa Claus that we have today. So a lot of that is tradition and mythology, but it goes back to a 3rd century saint, a person who was especially significant in his day, and shows us that really the heart of Christmas is grace. It's giving the gifts that others don't deserve, but that they need. That's the beauty of the story.
Well, and again, might as well just use that as a way to answer one of the other questions that came up, because if you read the daily article, and I say, again, it's a must read, people will notice that December 1st, so it goes back a couple of weeks, there was a man by the name of Chris Kennedy in North Little Rock, Arkansas. He put up some decorations and things like that. One of those was a statue of a black Santa Claus, and he received a letter in the mail saying, Santa Claus is Caucasian, and he went back and said, well, actually, take us back to this idea of St. Nicholas, because if anything, he probably was dark-skinned. Tell us more.
You would think so. Yeah, that was really kind of a horrific story, but really we had the opportunity, I think, to make a biblical point about all of this. So, yeah, this particular individual puts up this black Santa Claus in his front yard. He has a 4-year-old daughter and is wanting her to feel included in the Christmas story. And he gets this racist letter in the mail. Someone claiming Santa Claus is a Caucasian white man to you, end quote, and has been, quote, for the past 600 years, end quote. Well, when this man brought the letter to the Property Owners Association, they gave his family a complimentary membership. He said the rest of the neighborhood has been awesome since hearing about the letter. They'll stop by. They'll share kind words of encouragement. Some brought over cookies. One even brought a yard sign that says, love your neighbors, y'all, which sounds biblical to me. And so gave him a great chance to make the point Santa Claus isn't necessarily what that one neighbor, that anonymous letter perhaps thought he was. He's bigger than that. He's more universal than that.
And again, one of the arguments that you make here is St. Augustine says God loves each of us as if we were the only one of us. And that really is back to this idea that some of the division that you and I certainly have been writing about and talking about on this program is something that we need to address as well. And so I thought it was kind of interesting to take the first point in this very lengthy white page paper that you put together, and to focus on the fact that, if anything, the patron saint, I believe, even of the sailors, if I remember right, was St. Nicholas, and an individual that certainly had a great history, and that existed for some time. And then, of course, he was modified a little bit by first Clement Moore and some of the information that he put together on the visit from St. Nicholas. I might also add that I think Coca-Cola changed a few things a little bit later in terms of our image of St. Nicholas and Santa Claus. But nevertheless, that's the first point. We come back from the break. We're going to spend some time looking at some of the other things associated with Christmas. For example, why do we celebrate Christmas on December 25th? A little bit related to some of the conversation we had briefly with John Stone Street yesterday. Where was Jesus born is a very important question. The whole issue of Christ before Christmas, which gets us into the Messiah, gets us into some of the messianic prophecies and things of that nature. What about some of the issues of Mary and Joseph, and then even some of the traditions that we have? Are these things that we as Christians can use and celebrate? And so we wanted to just really spend some time getting into that. And most importantly, maybe you have a comment or a question. That number is 1-800-351-1212. Talking today with Dr. Jim Denison. We'll continue right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Most of us are aware how pervasive social media censorship has been over the last few years, but a recent commentary by Daniel Glertner illustrates how bizarre some of the censorship has become. He talks about a Facebook post about World War II that was appended with the false information tag. His comment was about the impact of gun control policies in Germany and how that could have led to the Holocaust. He had these relevant comments about the fact-checking on Facebook. First, he said, is the touchingly naive idea that a complex question, over which historians continue to argue, could be stamped true or false as though it were a fact you simply have been too lazy to look up. This fact-check label was placed on a Yale graduate who writes for Weekly Standard and has written on numerous topics, including military history. Second is the problem, he says, of the fact-checking article, which was full of factual errors. But that's not surprising, he said, when such articles are generally written by a 20-something journalism school graduate who becomes an expert in World War II that afternoon after her supervisor told her to research a meme on the internet. His experience parallels what so many other people have found. Often the fact-checker knows less about the subject than the person who posted the comment on social media. John Stossel recently documented that his YouTube video was slapped with a false label because the fact-checking group didn't like one of the experts he interviewed. The biggest problem with all of this, he says, is that Facebook has decided that this question, remote and unimportant as it might be in our daily lives, was not something you should be allowed to think about. We aren't talking about quack medicine or false information that could affect an election. The fact-checkers are going after any post they don't like. This is censorship greater than any of us would have imagined. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
What does the Bible say about Santa Claus? What does it say about Jesus? What does it say about Christmas and Christmas traditions? That's what we're talking about today with our good friend Dr. Jim Denison of the Denison Forum. Of course, there's Denison Ministries, and a little bit later I want to encourage you to go to the website so that you can find some of that. But Jim, let's, if we can, talk about why do we celebrate Christmas on December 25th? In other words, when was Jesus born? Then we'll get into where was Jesus born. There's always been this argument that, well, this just came from Roman tradition, but there are some reasons to believe that it's at least possible that Jesus was born on that date. What do we know?
Well, there's a lot inside that, as we know. The first thing that probably is kind of surprising to folks, unless they've thought about it, is nowhere does the Bible command us to celebrate Christmas. We're nowhere told we must celebrate the birth of Jesus. We're so grateful for his coming, obviously, for his incarnation, but as a holiday per se, it wasn't really focused on by the church for several centuries. It took a long period of time before they started making this a specific holiday, and then began the debates as regards when he was born and specifically the date that might be associated with all of that. So some of the background that gets into the Roman part of it is that they had a birthday of the sun, S-U-N, around December 25th because of the winter solstice. So the thinking here is that early Christians could use that as an opportunity to celebrate the birth of the sun, S-O-N, and use that pagan tradition to make spiritual points, to make spiritual truth and advance the gospel, which would be very similar to Jesus in John 4. The woman comes for water, so he starts with water and leads her to living water. Or Paul preaching from Greek philosophers in Acts 17 in order to share the gospel with Greek philosophers. So that's one thought that's behind all of this. As regards specifically when he was born, what we do know from Luke chapter 2 is that the shepherds were in the fields tending their sheep by night. They didn't typically do that in the winter. I've been to the shepherd's fields 30 times over the years, and I can tell you that in the wintertime, they kept the flock typically in caves. There's even a cave there that's usually thought as perhaps one of the caves that would be used. In addition, the Roman census, which brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem, typically wouldn't be possible in the winter because of the rains and the cold and the difficulty of travel. So most people think Jesus was most likely born in the springtime, and that the identification of his birth with December 25th would be to use this Roman tradition in order to accomplish a greater spiritual truth. But no one knows for sure because the Bible doesn't specify, because that's not the point of Christmas. The point of Christmas is that he was born so he can be born again in your heart and mind.
Well, again, we may not know when he was born, but we seem to know quite a bit about where he was born. And again, as you just mentioned in passing, you have traveled to Israel so many times. And I think in addition to getting the daily article, I think all of us would like to sign up for a tour that you lead to Israel sometime, because I think we would get so much benefit from that. But we do know a lot about where Jesus was born.
Yeah, we do. Thank you for that, Kerby. I know you do that as well. It's such a great privilege. One of my great losses this year is not being able to do that. I had to cancel 4 trips to Israel because of coronavirus and travel restrictions and all that. Can't wait to get back over there. So one of the things, as you know, you always love to do when you go to Israel is to go to Bethlehem and go to the Church of the Incarnation. You make your way inside through the Door of Humility, as it's known. It was built in the Crusader era, we think, and it's a low door so that marauders on horseback couldn't ride into the church and do damage and steal from the people. So you have to bend down to get through this door to get into the church, kind of typifying the fact that we come to Christmas in humility is kind of, I think, the point. Then you're into this Greek Orthodox Church. It's a massive structure, as you know. It goes back to the time of Constantine initially and then rebuilt it over the series of years in Crusaders primarily. You make your way to the front and around the altar, and you go down a set of steps, and now you're in a cave. This cave is not large. I can't stand up except in the very center of it with the sloping ceiling. It's dark and it's dingy, and there are all sorts of tapestries there now, but of course that wasn't the case then. It's a cave system. We don't know specifically the exact part of the cave system, but we know someplace in that system, someplace under there, was the place. We have from first century tradition, reliable tradition. That's the place where Jesus was born. It wasn't, unfortunately, the way that our manger scenes depict this. He was laid in a manger, which is what a feed trough. It was a stone feed trough after he was born in this dingy, difficult place, surrounded by field hands and by field animals. It demonstrated that if he would come with that humility, he'll come anywhere, even to your heart and mind.
And just, again, credible when you think of the humility, because he's just miles away from where he could have been born in a palace with Herod and all the rest. And instead, like you said, it is a place where you had innkeepers' animals. And, of course, like you said, that even there's no light except the fire. One light's inside, and then the smoke stings the eyes. There's no air circulation. It's probably damp and musty, probably about as bad as you can possibly imagine. And just reminds you again of this idea of the kenosis, if you will, of the fact that God humbled himself. So let's, if we can, move on. And that is, the cave where Jesus was born was only the earthly element of the miracle you talk about. But then you have a whole section here about Christ before Christmas. And it gets us really into the fact that we're in the Advent season, and we can really learn some things by going back and looking at those genealogies that we tend to skip over, and recognizing that there were so many prophecies written down in the Old Testament about this coming Messiah that were literally fulfilled in one person, Jesus Christ.
Absolutely true. In fact, I know you know this, but some years ago, a mathematician named Peter Stoner calculated 48 messianic prophecies, Old Testament predictions about Jesus fulfilled by the Lord Jesus. He then calculated the odds of Jesus fulfilling just 8 of these as 1 in 10 to the 17th power. That's a 1 followed by 17 zeros. Now, I'm getting into your space here as I'm starting to talk into some of this math and the science behind all of this, but he calculated that like this. If you filled the state of Texas 2 feet deep in silver dollars, made a little red dot on one of those silver dollars, led me around blindfolded all day. At the end of the day, I reached down and picked up a silver dollar. The odds I picked up the one you marked are the odds of Jesus fulfilling 8 of the 48 messianic prophecies. The odds of his fulfilling all 48 is 1 in 10 to the 157th power. That number is larger than the number of electrons in the universe. All that to say, Jesus coming fulfilled promises made centuries, even millennia earlier, and demonstrates this was always part of God's plan.
And again, as you point out, these are very specific. And of course, those that Peter Stoner dealt with were like from Zechariah, because you're talking about 30 pieces, silver, not gold, throne, potter's field. I mean, you just go through all these very specific kinds of things, as you point out here, even in terms of not only the birth of Jesus, but the death, crucified with thieves, no bones were broken, they suffer from thirst, buried in a rich man's tomb. These are so specific that, again, for somebody to argue, well, these were just coincidences, as you pointed out, the numbers just get so big so fast, given the specificity of that. And for just a minute, since you have oftentimes taught apologetics at major seminaries, it does seem to me that when we just look at the issue of messianic prophecies alone, we see something that is unique in religious literature. We have nothing else like that in any of the other religions, do we?
Exactly right, Kerby. It's a great point. And part of what the reason Stoner picked those prophecies as you're describing them is there's no way Jesus could have arranged to fulfill them himself. You could look at this and say, well, Jesus chose to do it like this because he'd read the Bible and wanted to make this look like that. Well, Stoner picked these prophecies he had no way to fulfill. Like that, the authorities would pay 30 pieces of silver to Judas. No way Jesus could have arranged that. Or that they wouldn't break his bones on the cross, fulfilling Psalm 22. But you're right. There's no prophecy like that regarding Muhammad, no prophecy regarding Buddha, no prophecy regarding any of the Jewish rabbis through the centuries. I don't mean that as disrespectful. It's just simply the case that Christianity uniquely stands on fulfilled prophecy as one of the most significant legs upon which we can build the case for the faith.
Let's, if I can, take a break, but let me just mention that I'm holding up our little booklet that I put together called A Biblical View on Messianic Prophecies. It's still available. If you'd like to get a free copy, we'd be glad to send it to you, and you can just leave a note to us on our website, pointofview.net, and find some of that information, and if that would be something that you would like to have to read. Or I've also found, certainly, Jim Denison, many times when I talk with a Jewish believer, if they just even believe in the authority of the Torah, much less anything else, but usually if they believe in the Old Testament, then can have a real conversation about some of these prophecies because they believe that those are indeed historical and accurate. And we, of course, can't argue that these prophecies were rewritten because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls and so much more. And I find that's a very effective evangelistic opportunity, isn't it?
Is. You're working with the authorities they already accept. It's like talking to a Muslim and you start with what Muslims already believe about Jesus and build a bridge from that over to the gospel. Well, you do the exact same thing with the Torah and with the Old Testament messianic prophecies, and you're showing Jewish believers that Jesus is, in fact, the Messiah for whom they're still praying today.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about what is available at the Denison Forum and Denison Ministries, and these two are resources that I wanted you to know more about, and so you can certainly spend some time looking at that. You might want to go to the website already and begin to familiar yourself with some of the material, and we'll take some time talking with Jim Denison before we continue on with this look at the whole issue of Christmas traditions, and turning the holiday into holy days, right after this.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation with Dr. Jim Denison, and if you would like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. Jim Denison, of course, is the head of Denison Forum, which is really seeking to equip you as Christians to discern news differently by engaging these cultural issues, really trying to apply biblical truth, and that's denisonforum.org. But that's just the beginning, because if you go to Denison Ministries, you will see that there is also some things we'd like to talk about. First 15 really is the attempt to lead believers into kind of a daily encounter with the Lord through great devotionals, and we'll talk about that. Christian parenting, really equipping you if you're a parent or a grandparent to raise children up. And then, of course, if that's not enough, Jim Denison is married to Janet Denison, and she's had this teaching ministry as well to help believers apply God's Word to their lives. So there is quite a bit, Jim Denison, but before we take some phone calls and continue on talking about the biblical view of Christmas and the Christmas traditions, talk about all the things available through Denison Ministries. And I know you're going to have to take a deep breath to actually cover all of those in any kind of meaningful time. So go for it.
Kerby, thank you so much for the privilege of doing that. So our larger purpose is to build what we call culture-changing Christians, Christians who will use their influence to make a difference in the culture for Jesus. So we do that on a variety of levels, lanes on the freeway, as you might imagine. Denison Forum was our first brand, and that's the one that I lead, and it works specifically on cultural issues, news discerned differently, helping people think biblically about cultural issues, very similar to what you do in radio and print as well. We do this through daily emails called the Daily Article, goes out to about 200,000 subscribers around the world, a total social media reach of about 1.9 million. Then we have white papers and books that are inside that brand as well. First 15, first15.org, gives people an opportunity every day to have a transformational experience with Jesus through a worship video, a guided devotional time, and a prayer time that helps people encounter him so they have the strength of the Holy Spirit in order to be the culture-changing Christian God is calling them to be. My wife's Bible teaching ministry, JanetDenison.org, helps people through a digital Bible study that's available now, and curriculum and Advent guide that's written for right now, and a variety of other sources to help people study Scripture for themselves in a way that will equip them to make a difference in the culture. ChristianParenting.org works on helping parents to raise children and know and love the Lord. It's built on the premise that the most important generation in American history is in fourth grade right now. And what we can do to build to that is going to be a critical part of the future. And then our fifth brand is specifically for pastors and leaders, called The Pastor's View. It's a weekly blog. It's occasional videos. I'll be recording some later today and again next week. It's seminars and conferences and retreats helping leaders and pastors think biblically about cultural issues. So all of that is found in one place, DenisonMinistries.org. That's the portal that gives people an opportunity to go to the various brands and experience those resources. So
again, if you want one-stop shopping, that's the place to go. And let's, if we can, keep going. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. And I thought we might talk about the things associated with the birth of Jesus. That would be Mary and Joseph and the wise men, before we get into some of the church traditions and some of the Christian traditions and even some of the Christmas traditions. But what do we know there? Because it seems, again, that we have some information that is in the Scriptures, but I've also found, especially by the time we get to the wise men, we make some assumptions that aren't actually in the Scriptures, right?
Actually true. In fact, the first time I came in touch with that, I was a pastor, actually. I was pastoring my first church, a very small congregation outside of Fort Worth, and on that particular Sunday, I got into who Mary and Joseph really were and who the wise men really were. My wife was not happy with me, because this significantly impeded her celebration of the manger scene she had at the house and the way that everybody pictures all of this. Yes. It can be a little difficult because what we know is really not what tradition necessarily says. So Mary, you can start with Mary was probably a 7th or 8th grader, as we would understand.
Wow.
Typically, people were engaged by their parents, arranged to be married as young girls, and when they became, quite frankly, and when they became of age where they could bear children, is typically when they were married. There were very high infant mortality rates in those days. It was difficult to give birth without modern medicine, of course, and so women typically married young. And so it's very likely that Mary would have been 13, 14, 15 years old, something like that. Joseph would likely have been 30 years of age. Typically, a man came to that place where he could have his own business and therefore could marry and could have a family and all that's inside that. So likely around that age or so. He was a tekton, which is the Greek word that we translate carpenter, means a man who works with his hands. He could have been working with wood, with stone, with a variety of different building materials. He was not a wealthy person. We know that because when Jesus was born, the sacrifice that was made for him at the temple was the sacrifice only allowed to very, very impoverished families. And we knew that they lived in Nazareth, which was a town so small that in the first century, we think, it depends on how archaeologists grade things, but probably maybe 20 families, maybe no more than 100 people. It's a town mentioned not once in the Old Testament, not once by Josephus. That's how tiny and insignificant that little town was. So we're thinking about essentially peasant parents, a teenager and what you could think of as a blue-collar worker living in a very small town. That's the parents Jesus chose. He's the only baby that chose his parents, and he chose those parents.
That's incredible. And again, just some great material in the particular material that we've made available. But what about the wise men? How many were there? When did they arrive? This is where you really start rattling people's cages.
I'm afraid you do. Yeah, we three kings of Orient are, and all the songs that we're familiar with. So most likely there would have been 12 or so because they traveled in that larger group for safety's sake. They came from Persia, even modern-day Iran. It may be a little troublesome to know that the first worshipers of Jesus from a distance would have been what we call Iranian. They were known as astrologers. They were magicians as well as the scholars of the day. And the part that most bothers people, if they really discover this, they weren't there the night of Jesus' birth.
No, yeah.
There was a star that night, but it took as long as 2 years to get there. That's why when they told Herod about the birth of the baby, he killed all the children 2 years old and under, according to the time he learned from the Magi. When they found Jesus in Matthew 2, they came to the house, the text says, not to the manger. They met the mother and his child, and it's not the word of the Greek for the newborn baby. And so they were as much as 2 years after the birth of Jesus, as many as 12 of them. They offered 3 gifts, which is sometimes why people think there were 3 wise men, but a much larger group than that and from a very distant country.
So again, just all sorts of things that people misunderstand, because we do know that there were 3 categories of gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Don't know that there were just 3 gifts. There may have been more. We don't know that there were 3, probably a dozen. As a matter of fact, there's some church traditions that say there were 12, maybe because of the idea of the 12 apostles and 12 tribes of Israel. But nevertheless, those are just some great illustrations there as well. But I thought for a few minutes we might also talk about some of the traditions. And one of those, which I think is one that we could all agree with, is the idea of lighting a candle. And you talk about that because in some respects that certainly brings us back to being the light of the world, and it is something that we do so often at church services, especially on Christmas Eve services. So what do we need to know about that?
Yeah, thank you, Kerby. It's one of the earliest Christmas traditions, lighting a candle to symbolize the coming of the light of God. John chapter 1, Jesus was the light coming into the world. And so the candle symbolized that and signified Jesus as that light. Then there's another part of that tradition I didn't put in the paper, but that I really, really appreciate. The tradition is that over the centuries, there was the idea that the Christ child would come to your village every Christmas Eve to see if he would have room there. There was no room in the inn, but perhaps there would be room for the Christ child in your home. And the way to tell him there was room for him in your home was to put a candle in your window. And a candle in your window was saying to Jesus, you are welcome in my home and in my heart. I think it's a wonderful tradition. Of course, we're not saying Jesus physically came to those towns or those villages, but rather it was a way of saying that if it were Christmas tonight, Jesus would be welcome here. And the candle is a way of telling the world that Jesus is welcome in this home.
Let's again take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into a couple of other issues. What about this idea of a Christmas tree? That obviously is not first century, but we wanted to give you a little bit of that history. We sometimes adorn a door with a wreath. What about the poinsettia, the mistletoe, even the idea of a Christmas card? But most importantly, we'll wind down by talking about this is certainly a holiday, but one of the things that I know Jim Denison has really dedicated himself to, and even during the time in which we've talked about some of this and even focused on this Advent, there are Advent devotional guides which are available. So how could we turn these holidays into holy days? And so again, that's one of the reasons why we point you not only to Denison Forum, which is such an outstanding resource, but also Denison Ministries, so that you can find some of the Advent devotionals, so that you can find some of the other devotionals, so that you know a little bit more about how to raise your children and grandchildren, because most of us are not privileged enough, like Jim Denison, to have grandchildren that have no sin nature. So obviously we need a little more help than maybe the Denison family needs. But we need to take a break. And if nothing else, we'll come back and talk about Christmas trees, wreaths, plants, and a variety of other things that we'll get into real quickly. But most importantly, how to turn these holidays into a holy day. Jim Denison with us, and with, of course, Denison Ministries and Denison Forum. We'll continue our conversation with Dr. Jim Denison right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dr. Jim Denison, and if you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and listen as we talk now about some of the decorations, some of the traditions, whether it's a Christmas tree or a wreath or mistletoe. What about that, Jim Denison? Because in some respects, there are some Christians that say, I'm not going to go through all of that, and we won't have those traditions. That's fine, but I think there's grace and there's freedom in the gospel, but where does the idea of a Christmas tree come from?
Yeah, great question, Kerby. The tradition, as we understand it, goes back to Martin Luther. We think of Luther, of course, as that great reformer, the 95 Theses and all of that. But the story is that he was on his way home one night through the Black Forest in Germany. He looks up through the trees and sees the stars twinkling there, thinks it's such a beautiful example of God's creative grace. So he brings a tree home, and they put candles in the branches. Again, the candles reminding us of Jesus, the light of the world. And in that way, brought the beauty of God's nature into their home as a Christmas tree. And the tradition gets picked up and carried across Germany and Europe and eventually to America. But it also points out this fact. The Christmas tree reminds us that Jesus was born to die on a tree. As the scripture says, cursed is everyone who dies on a tree. Jesus died on a cross of wood so that that Christmas tree could bring about the Christmas miracle of eternal life in our hearts. An evergreen tree, demonstrating the evergreen nature of God's love for us. So when we see the Christmas tree, we need to remember that he was the only child that was born to die for us. And he came for our sake, born that we might be born again.
Very good. Again, you also have all sorts of other decorations, things like a wreath, the poinsettia, mistletoe. What about that?
Yeah, the wreath takes us back to really predates Christianity. In our day, if someone wins an Olympic gold medal, then we celebrate their achievement. And that day, it was a wreath. It was something you would wear on your as a crown or might put in other places. So the wreath symbolizes victory. Well, the Christmas wreath symbolizes the victory we have in Christ. That who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine, nakedness or peril or sword? As it is written, for thy sake we're killed all the day long. We're accounted as sheep for the slaughter. But in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us, Paul writes in Romans chapter 8. And the victory wreath of Christmas reminds us of that we have eternal victory in Christ. When you think about the poinsettia, you're a poinsettia sometimes called, you're thinking about the Honorable Joel Poinsett, member of President Van Buren's cabinet. He was a minister to Mexico. He was traveling in the Mexican countryside, saw this beautiful plant he found growing there when he returned to South Carolina, brought the plant with him, began growing it, and that's why it's named for him. But the red leaves of the poinsettia plant, blooming during the Christmas season, remind us of the blood of Jesus shed on the cross for us. So whether it's the tree or it's the poinsettia, we're reminded of why Christmas happened, that Jesus came for a reason, and the reason for the season is his love for us.
Let's see if we can, just before we run out of time, then talk about how to turn the holidays into holy days, because you talk about the fact that each of these Christmas traditions has a spiritual story to tell, and I'm sure some people are going to say, I want to go back and listen to this or get this material because I would like to share that around the Christmas table or maybe even share it in a sermon or a Sunday school. But you also have the idea of an Advent calendar and Advent devotional guide. The word Advent comes from the Latin, means arrival. But what about Advent? Because some of our listeners are very familiar with an Advent calendar. I think some are going, I'm not really sure what Advent really is. Can you explain that?
You bet. And that's a place where I, coming from more of a Baptist or free church tradition, didn't grow up really around Advent as the larger Christian family understands it. Advent has historically been not only celebrating Jesus' first coming, but reminding us of his second coming, that the child who came is coming back. And when he comes back, he'll be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And so the Advent season reminds us every single day of his first coming and of his eventual and imminent return as well. So my wife, Janet, every year writes an Advent guide that's, again, we make available through our website to those that might be interested in it. It's a daily reading. She's done this for 8 or 9 years now. And each day of the Advent season, there's a reading, a devotional, and a biblical study that helps us remember what Jesus did and prepare for what he's going to do when he comes back. And it could be today. I had a professor in seminary who said, I don't know when Jesus is coming back, but I know we're one day closer than we've ever been.
That's for sure. You also suggest that this would be a great time to give to missions. And, of course, again, those of us that are Baptist recognize how this is certainly a giving time, year-end and missions and a number of other things. But this is something that I would encourage people to give to missions. I would also encourage people to give to Denison Ministries, because you and your family have done just an outstanding job of reaching not only people in this country, but literally around the world through all sorts of resources. And this is an opportunity during year end to consider what people might do to support some of these ministries that have ministered to them.
Well, that's true. In fact, nearly half of our budget comes in December, and toward end of year, we're entirely a donor-based ministry. And so anything people would be led by God to do would be a wonderful thing. I certainly think of your ministry, Kerby, of what you and Point of View were doing, and the fact that you, like us, are donor-supported. That enables you to give away your resources, as it were, to be able to give the Word of God away because people are partnering with you through an investment in sharing the good news of Christmas all year round. I would certainly urge, you didn't ask me to say this, but I would certainly urge those that are hearing this conversation right now to pray about the degree to which God would lead you to make a sacrificial gift to the Holy Spirit's leading, to advancing the gospel and telling the good news of Christmas through Point of View and through what specifically you're doing, not just now, but all year round.
Let me just, again, encourage you to go to the website. It is denisonministries.org, or, of course, you can go to Denison Forum for some of the material that we've been talking about here today. But the real mission is to build culture-changing Christians. And as we have talked about on this program before, there have been different ways that Christians have interacted with culture. Richard Niebuhr has certainly given us some perspective in that regard. But it's almost not a complete Jim Denison ministry without mentioning James Davidson Hunter and his book, The Changing the World, because we talk about that so often. And the need for us to really, Jim, have a faithful presence. And that, in some respects, is what you are trying to do. Take some of the ideas that James Davidson Hunter's been on the program with us, but it's been years. We need to get him back on here. But if I have him on, I'm going to have you next to me asking some of those questions to really focus on how we can make a difference in the world. And that's really, in a sense, how all of these different brands of Denison Ministries all come together, isn't it?
Well, that's kind of you to say. Yes. Some years ago, James Davidson Hunter, University of Virginia, wrote a book to change the world, which really changed my world. He demonstrated that culture changes when you achieve your highest place of influence and live there faithfully. He called it manifesting faithful presence. And when you do that, when you're salt and light with excellence at your highest place of influence, God uses you to change and shape the culture in ways you can see and ways you can't see. It's the seed that's planted. It's the salt that is absorbed. It's the light that overcomes the dark. And so the challenge and the encouragement during this Christmas season for those hearing us today is to find your highest place of influence, live there with excellence as a salt and light Christian, share the good news of God's love, and know that what you do will never return void. I love this definition of greatness that Albert North Whitehead suggested some years ago. Great people plant trees they'll never sit under.
That's so well said.
That's what we're all privileged to do.
Well, Jim Denison, Dr. Jim Denison, always great to have you on the program. And I guess I won't see you before Christmas. So I want to wish you and Janet Merry Christmas. And thank you, as always, for being on Point of View.
Kerby, Merry Christmas to you and yours. So grateful for you.
Just about out of time, so let me just mention that, again, we have links to all of this. You can go to Denison Forum or denisonministries.org. Either way, it's going to provide you with some of those resources. If you find yourself saying, I want to read a few of those articles you've been talking about, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net. Hope you'll consider supporting their ministry and maybe ours as well. But most importantly, hope you'll be tuning in tomorrow. It is going to be our weekend edition. Kelly Shackelford, Penedexter. Oh, do we have a lot to cover? And Kelly Shackelford has actually been with the Vice President of President and maybe has some inside knowledge on some things. So I'm looking forward to that as well. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
I am tired. 2020 has been a hard year for most of us, and though I'm guessing that we're all ready to leave it behind, the reality is that 2021 will arrive with its own set of uncertainties. About the only thing that we know for sure is that seeing every issue, every challenge through biblically trained eyes will be sorely needed. That's what you provide to people all across this nation and right here at home as you support Point of View Radio. People are tuning in. They're listening for longer times than before. It reveals that we're all desperate for fresh, rational, reliable, honest, hope-filled perspectives, and that's what you find on Point of View. Without you, that doesn't happen. But with you, hope will flow and hope will grow. Do your part for hope today at pointofview.net/donate or call 800-347-5151. Keep fighting with us. Give today. Pointofview.net/donate and 800-347-5151. 5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.